Good morning, everyone. So here lately, there's been a lot of talk about the link between Bryan Kohberger and the serial killer BTK. Now, that link is his ex-professor, renowned forensic psychologist, professor, and serial killer expert, Dr. Catherine Ramsland. Dr. Ramsland was one of the professors for Kohberger at Desales University, where he studied criminology. So I went ahead and I gathered up all the articles that I could find to share with you guys. But first, let's look into who Dr. Catherine Ramsland is. This comes straight from the Desales University faculty website. Dr. Catherine Ramsland teaches forensic psychology and is an assistant provost. She created the forensic track in the psychology program and assisted to create the online Master of Arts degree in criminal justice. She has appeared in more than 200 crime documentaries and magazine shows, is an executive producer of Murder House Flip, and consulted for CSI, Bones, and The Alienist. The author of more than 1,500 articles and 68 books, including How to Catch a Killer, The Psychology of Death Investigations, and The Mind of a Murderer. She worked with the BTK serial killer, Dennis Rader, on his autobiography. Dr. Ramsland currently pens the Shadowboxing blog at Psychology Today and teaches seminars on extreme offenders to death investigators and homicide detectives. She came to Desales specifically to teach forensic psychology, focusing on her field of expertise, extreme offenders. Having experienced the excitement of forensic psychology, she hopes to show students how to find and prepare for its many opportunities. Here's a list of her vast teaching credentials as well as her professional affiliations, if you want to pause them and read through them. Yesterday, Dennis Rader's daughter spoke out on Twitter. She said, Dr. Catherine Ramsland was one of Bryan Kohberger's professors in criminology studies at Desales University, where he earned a master's degree last spring. Ramsland has, or did have, a close academic relationship and friendship with my father, Dennis Rader, BTK. She says, I have ongoing concerns knowing how common it is for criminology students, true crime fans, and others to correspond regularly with my father, that Kohberger could have been in contact with my father at some point, but require proof of this, which currently I do not know of. My father and his many murders are studied intensively in the field of criminology. I believe strongly in the training of future law enforcement, criminology, and forensic minds, and give great lectures myself to further educate in these fields. My father graduated with a bachelor's in criminal justice from Wichita State University, making a mockery of this important field, using his college courses to study his own ongoing murders and get access to law enforcement information in the 1970s. My thoughts have been with the victims' friends and family and law enforcement since news broke of this horrific crime, and my thoughts are also with Kohberger's friends and family at this time. It is my hope justice will be served fully. The ripples of one man's horrific actions will be felt for generations, affecting not only the families, but the wider Idaho community, the supporting law enforcement, and criminology communities. We must continue to work together to seek answers to these crimes, stop these predators quicker, and find ways to prevent these crimes from happening at all.
Tonight, we are tracking a new question. Could the infamous serial killer known as BTK have influenced the accused murderer in the Idaho stabbings? News Nation is learning that quadruple homicide suspect Bryan Kohberger studied under the same professor and criminology expert that literally wrote the book on BTK, his biography. News Nation senior correspondent Bryan live for us tonight. Bryan, you spoke directly with BTK's daughter about any possible connection.
Yeah, she said she has literally been sick to her stomach ever since she found out that there could possibly be a connection here. She's been following the situation in Idaho very closely, and now there is this chilling connection between BTK and Bryan Kohberger. Basically, Bryan Kohberger's professor at Desales University here in Pennsylvania, when he was studying criminology, wrote the book, you mentioned it on BTK, actually wrote BTK's autobiography and interviewed him extensively to write this book, and then taught a class that we believe Kohberger took on serial killers that was heavily focused on BTK. So was he perhaps inspired by BTK? We don't know the answer to that yet, but certainly that is something that the FBI is going to be looking into. BTK's daughter spoke to me also just about what it was like having a psychopath father, and the way that these killers are able to act one way around their family and seem so normal, but have this devious side to them. Listen to part of our conversation.
After being raised by a psychopath, I do know that they can hide very easily, that they can put on several masks and basically change how they're interacting with you, mimic you. Basically, a lot of times they're saying to you what they think you want to hear. So I would assume Kohberger held himself in a certain way in a professional educational setting. I'm kind of shocked how far he's made it into the criminology fields. But it's happened before. My father has a criminal justice degree. D'Angelo, Golden State Killer, he has one. Bundy, I believe, studied criminal law. So it happens. I mean, you can be an expert on psychopaths and they're still going to trick you. And honestly, somebody like Kohberger probably found that thrilling.
And Dr. Catherine Ramsland, the expert that she's talking about there, who was the professor of Bryan Kohberger and also wrote the book on BTK, really one of the preeminent experts on serial killers. And what's just so chilling, Natasha, is to think about that she was teaching Kohberger, and that this all has now played out the way it has. We've tried to talk to her. Basically, she is saying right now that she is not doing any media interviews on Kohberger. You would assume that she will likely be some kind of witness if and when this all finally goes to trial, Natasha.
Outside of confirming that Bryan was in her class, Dr. Ramsland has declined to speak with anyone. I did find this article and I thought it was very interesting. It's an old article about her time with BTK. It's a pretty long read, but I did find it very interesting into her mind a little bit. So if you want to hang in there with me, here we go. Dennis Rader appeared as an ordinary family man in Wichita, Kansas, who collected stamps and served as the president of his church. But the seemingly doting father and trusted Cub Scout leader was also a murderer who terrorized residents for decades, using the moniker BTK, which stands for Bind, Torture, Kill. In 2005, Rader, now 76, pled guilty to killing 10 people from 1974 to 1991. And for over a decade, Rader corresponded with Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a professor of forensic psychology, to better understand how lust, as well as a desire for fame and power, drove him to kill. Now she's sharing her story. Ramsland is speaking out in a new true crime docuseries on A&E titled BTK, Confessions of a Serial Killer. The 2-night special from executive producer Dick Wolf of the Law & Order franchise features never-before-heard conversations between Rader and Ramsland as they discuss his past and gruesome crimes. When I first wrote to him, he appreciated the fact that I had academic credentials and that I was also an expert on serial killers because I had done a lot of writing on them prior to talking with him, Ramsland told Fox News. But he had a test for me. He wanted me to solve some codes that he sent me. He wanted to make sure I wouldn't just dismiss it. But for practical purposes, he wanted to use codes to disguise what we were talking about when we got into very dark, raw subjects. And I was willing to do that. That was a good signal to him that I would work with him in the way he wanted. Ramsland first corresponded with Rader in 2010. They exchanged numerous letters, spoke on the phone, and even met face-to-face at El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in Kansas. In 2016, Ramsland wrote the book Confessions of a Serial Killer, the untold story of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, under an agreement that proceeds from its sale would go to the victim's family's trust fund. My initial impression of Dennis Rader was that he wanted to challenge me, Ramsland said, and what surprised me was the fact that there wasn't anything in his background that would correspond with the typical formula we have of serial killers. I recently heard a detective say that all serial killers have trauma in their background. He was wrong about that. Dennis Rader challenges the idea we have about serial killers, she added. He was a family man, he was a churchgoer, even a president of his church congregation. He had a full-time job, he was part of his community. So we have to be careful about some of the stereotypes we form about these kind of offenders. Otherwise, we'll start thinking we know them when we don't. And in Dennis's case, there wasn't any particular reason in his background. No trauma. He was an all-American boy, the oldest of 4 boys in his family. He had an intact family and played on his farm. So where did it all come from? That intrigued me. Rader joined the Air Force and married Paula DeetS in 1971. Every Sunday, he and his spouse went to church. The couple shares 2 children, a boy and a girl. Rader's father, who died in 1996, after retiring as a plant operator at a utility company's generating station, was described by childhood pals as strict but never cruel, the New York Times reported. Rader struck as the BTK for the first time in 1974. 4 members of the Otero family: Joseph, 38, wife, Julie, 34, and 2 other children. Josephine, 11, and Joseph II, 9, were bound and strangled inside their homes. The slain matriarch had worked on an assembly line for the Coleman Company, the same place Rader worked in the early 70s. Rader taunted the media and police with cryptic messages during a cat-and-mouse game that began after the murders. He signed the letters BTK. That same year, 21-year-old Catherine Bright, who also worked at the Coleman plant, was found stabbed in her home. She was bound with a cord and partially dressed. Her brother was shot but survived. Rader returned to his seemingly normal life until 1977. Shirley Vane, 24, was found on her bed with a plastic bag over her head and a cord wrapped around her neck and feet. That same year, 25-year-old Nancy Fox was strangled with nylon stockings in her home. Rader hid in plain sight as he helped raise his family. Then, in 1985, 53-year-old Marion Hedge was found strangled alongside a dirt road. The next year, 28-year-old Vicky Wigurley was found strangled in her bed. Rader returned to a low-profile life once more as he became heavily involved in his church community. That changed in 1991 when he abducted 62-year-old Dolores Davis, his final victim, from her home. She was found strangled and bound under a bridge. Ramsland said that growing up, Rader was humiliated by his mother, which stayed with him over the years. That really played on him, she explained. It's something he still thinks about, even to this day. And we haven't studied humiliation as a factor in the development of extreme offenders much, and I think maybe we should rethink that. And he certainly got an early exposure to using ropes for an erotic activity. And then he began to read these true detective magazines that his father would hide in the car. So that made him clandestine. He wanted to feel significant, and he wanted to have power over women because females made him feel off balance. He didn't like that as the oldest boy he was expected to be strong and masculine, and yet they seemed to kneecap him right and left without even trying. Just by being female, she shared, and his fantasy life certainly propelled him. Rader resurfaced in 2004 with more chilling, taunting letters. The break in the case came in 2005 after a computer disk Rader sent was traced back to his church. His chilling courtroom confession ended a mystery that haunted Wichita for decades. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in prison. During that courtroom hearing, Dennis felt like he had a position to teach people about who he was, said Ramsland, In a way, he also thought of himself as a victim. He thought he had some things in common with the victims. Rader is a narcissist, so he just thought this was a way to present himself. When asked if Rader saw himself as a monster, Ramsland said, "At times." Dennis Rader does think of himself as a monster, but he also thinks of himself as a good person who did some bad things, she explained. He will talk about a monster in his brain. It's his Factor X, which is a way to distance himself from criminal responsibility. He thinks for the most part he's not a monster. He certainly was in those instances when he selected a victim and carried through with his crimes. But overall, he doesn't think of himself that way. As for remorse, Ramsland said it depends on the day. He certainly regrets a lot because he doesn't want to be in prison, she shared. He didn't want to lose his family. There's a lot of regret there with that. But that's not the same as remorse. It depends on his mood. It's a concept he calls cubing, where he has various faces of a cube he can turn on and off. So sometimes he's a good family man, and sometimes he's a serial killer, a thief, or a liar. Sometimes he's the churchgoer who studies the Bible. So it depends on what day you get him as to whether you'll hear him talk about remorse. I found a lot of this very interesting, but since we don't know a whole lot about Bryan yet, I don't know if I can relate him to BTK or any other serial killer for that matter. We're just going to have to wait and find out more information, in my opinion. Plus, at this time, he's not technically a serial killer. He'd be considered a mass murderer. Unless some other information comes out relating to other murders, he's just a suspect in this one situation, which would be considered a mass murder. But let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm very interested in hearing other thoughts and ideas. Y'all have a great day.